Today, we're looking at California's Emerald Triangle. You know, a place famous for cannabis?
Legendary, really.
But there's this hidden side, isn't there? A story about how Mexican drug cartels got involved and, well, really changed things up there.
Yeah, exactly. We're drawing on some detailed work here from NuggNotes, which kind of lays out how this whole cartel involvement in cannabis growing evolved step by step in that specific area.
Right. So our mission today for this deep dive is to figure out, what allowed this to happen? What methods did the cartels use?
And the consequences, right. Environmental, social, it's a big story.
Huge. We'll also touch on legalization, Prop 64, and why maybe it didn't just wipe the slate clean. It's going to reshape how you think about the Emerald Triangle, I bet.
Okay, so let's rewind. Back to the 80s. That's really where this phase kicks off.
Okay, so 1983. California launches the campaign against marijuana planting. Sounds straightforward.
Yeah, the goal was clear. Get rid of the pot farms.
But like you said, it kind of backfired.
Well, yeah. By cracking down so hard on the local growers, forcing them deeper underground, CMP basically created a shortage. And prices, they just skyrocketed.
Skyrocketed how much?
We're talking maybe $100 a pound before, jumping up to like $4,000 a pound.
Wow. Okay, so that's a massive incentive.
Absolutely. It's like putting out a giant welcome mat for anyone who already knows how to move product, and that's where the Sinaloa cartel steps in. They already had the smuggling infrastructure.
For cannabis, mainly?
Yeah, mostly cannabis at that point. So California just looked like this incredibly profitable new market opening up. A logical next step, really.
Okay, but then things changed at the border, right? The whole war on drugs ramps up.
Exactly. Border security got much tighter. Suddenly, just smuggling the finished product across the border became way riskier, more expensive.
So they adapted.
They did. Sinaloa, pretty smartly, shifted strategy. Instead of just smuggling it in, they started growing it directly in California.
And they picked specific spots.
Remote public lands. Think Mendocino National Forest, Shasta Trinity. Places that were hard to get to, hard to patrol.
The Emerald Triangle itself.
The perfect conditions, really. You've got rugged terrain for cover, plenty of water, relatively clean water sources back then, and just isolation. Ideal for hiding massive grows.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Then we hit the 90s, and this quiet invasion, as NuggNotes calls it, starts getting, well, less quiet.
Yeah, the signs become pretty clear. 1992, Mendocino County again. Cops find a grow site. Not just a few plants, like 7,000 plants.
7,000. Okay, that's substantial.
Right. And what stood out was they found Spanish language materials there. Plus, the irrigation system was really sophisticated, professional grade.
Not your typical small-time local grower setup.
Definitely not. It signaled a whole different level of organization, different resources involved.
And this wasn't just a one-off thing.
No, far from it. By 97, so just 5 years later, NuggNotes suggests something like 90% of the outdoor weed grows in the Emerald Triangle had cartel links.
90%. That's basically a takeover.
Pretty much. Wow. And the scale was just massive.
Yeah.
We're talking raids uncovering sites with over 23,000 plants.
23,000.
Yeah. And these weren't just plants hidden away. They had diesel generators humming away, powering lights, irrigation.
Actual infrastructure.
Totally. Guard towers sometimes, camp set up to house maybe 15, sometimes more. Workers right there on site in national forests. The audacity was pretty incredible.
Okay, so the scale is huge. The organization is clear. Then, early 2000s, things escalate again.
A new group starts making noise.
That's
La Familia Michoacana. Right. And, well, things got more violent when they showed up.
So they muscles in?
Yeah, they expanded the footprint, you could say. Pushing into the Central Valley, more spots on the North Coast, beyond just the core Emerald Triangle. And their arrival definitely coincided with an uptick in violence connected to the grows.
And the grows themselves kept getting bigger.
Oh, yeah. 2002, there was a bust linked to La Familia, get this, 100,000 plants.
100,000 plants. That's almost unbelievable.
It's staggering. And that same year, 2002, something really significant happened down in Tulare County. It kind of highlighted this change in attitude.
What was that?
There was a raid on a grow, inside a national park, actually. And it turned into a shootout. A cartel enforcer linked to La Familia was killed defending the plants.
Defending the plants on U.S. soil in a national park.
Exactly. It showed they weren't just going to cut and run anymore. They were willing to fight violently against law enforcement here. It was like they were treating California itself as their narco turf,
Yeah.
worth dying for.
That's a major shift. And it wasn't just violence against people, right? The mid-2000s saw huge environmental problems starting to surface.
Oh, absolutely devastating. The environmental damage from these illegal grows was, well, it's hard to overstate. Think about water, for instance.
Right. Plants need water. Lots of it.
Huge amounts. A single big grow site could be sucking down over 60,000 gallons a day.
60,000 gallons daily.
Daily. And this is often happening during major droughts in California, when water is already incredibly scarce.
How are they getting it? Just running hoses into rivers?
Basically, yeah, really crude methods, damming up streams, digging these illegal reservoirs, diverting water flows, completely ignoring endangered species, downstream users, everything, just taking the water.
And then there were the chemicals.
Oh, the pesticides. Nasty stuff. They were using chemicals banned in the U.S. for years, like Carbofuran.
Carbofuran. I've heard of that. It's incredibly toxic.
Lethal. Even a tiny amount can kill birds, mammals, fish, and of course it gets into the soil, into the water, and moves up the food chain.
With predictable results, I imagine.
Horrific results. You mentioned NuggNotes earlier. They point to research finding rodenticides, rat poison basically, probably used to keep pests off the plants, finding that poison in over 80% of dead Pacific fishers they tested.
80%. That's, wow. These are rare animals too, right?
Exactly. Carnivores high up the food chain getting poisoned. So you picture these beautiful forests. Suddenly they're becoming hazardous waste sites. Toxic chemicals everywhere, piles of trash, human waste. It completely disrupts the ecosystem.
Just grim. And by the late 2000s, this started spilling over more directly onto the local communities.
Yeah, the impact on people living there got much worse. Violence wasn't just potential, it was happening.
How so?
We started seeing reports more frequently of armed growers actually shooting at people. Hikers, fishermen, even wildlife officers who just stumbled onto a grow site by accident.
So people couldn't even safely use their own public lands anymore.
It became much riskier. And then the murders. In 2008, tragically, a Yuki tribe elder and his nephew were killed on their own ancestral land. That really shattered any lingering image of the Emerald Triangle being just, peaceful hippie growers.
That's absolutely awful. And the grows were still massive.
Still huge. Finding operations with 50,000, even up to that 100,000 plant mark, often on federal or tribal lands.
And how are these being funded? Still just cartel money?
A lot of it, yeah. But interestingly, reports started indicating some funding came from remittances money sent back home, often to Mexico, by family members working elsewhere. It shows how deeply embedded these operations were in the broader cartel networks.
And the authorities were taking notice.
Oh, yeah. The Department of Justice put out a report around then, basically warning that California's forests were turning into cartel strongholds. Their estimate. Up to 70% of all outdoor cannabis in the state might be cartel-backed.
70%. That's control.
Pretty much. Which leads us into the 2010s, and you start seeing a much bigger law enforcement response, but also the cartels keep evolving.
Right. So what happens in the 2010s? More crackdowns.
Big time. 2010 saw a record number of plants eradicated, 7.4 million plants destroyed in California. And officials said the vast majority were linked to the cartels.
7.4 million. Okay, so enforcement is ramping up.
Definitely. Then in 2011, there was this big multi-agency thing called Operation Full Court Press. They hit like 50 major cartel sites.
And what did they find?
Hundreds of thousands of plants, seized a lot of guns, and tons of those dangerous chemicals we were talking about. A major haul.
But did it stop the cartels? Or did new players just move in?
Well, that's the thing. Around this time, the influence of Sinaloa and La Familia seemed to dip a bit. Maybe because of arrests, maybe infighting, who knows. But another group really started rising in prominence, CJNG.
CJNG, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. They're known for being particularly aggressive, right?
Extremely. And they brought their own flavor of tactics to the Emerald Triangle grows.
Like what?
NuggNotes mentions they were heavily involved in trafficking the workers needed for these remote sites, pouring even more money into setting them up, and really fortifying the locations.
Fortifying how? Like walls?
More like booby traps, motion sensors to detect anyone approaching, sophisticated radio networks for scouts watching the perimeter. It became much more militarized in a way.
Wow. So even with massive eradication efforts, they're digging in harder. And the environmental damage continued.
Continued and worsened. By the mid-2010s, the U.S. Forest Service was calling these cartel grows their single biggest environmental threat. more damaging even than wildfires in some ways.
Their top threat. That's saying something.
Yeah, and the examples are just awful. Cleanup crews find car batteries dumped in creeks, just leaching acid. Huge tangles of plastic irrigation tubing left behind, choking plants. Wildlife found dead from poisoning everywhere. Some sites, just one site, could leave behind over 3,000 pounds of trash.
3,000 pounds of garbage and chemicals per site.
Per site, it's staggering. And then there's the human side, which also got darker.
How so? We talked about violence, but...
The labor situation. It really started looking more and more like straight-up human trafficking.
Trafficking.
Yeah. Many of the workers were undocumented migrants brought up from Mexico or Central America, and they were often trapped in debt bondage.
Meaning they owed money to the traffickers or the grow bosses?
Exactly. They'd be told they owed thousands for being smuggled in, or for food and supplies at the camp. Wages would be withheld. They couldn't leave.
They were essentially prisoners.
Pretty much. There was a federal case around this time that really laid it bare. Evidence showed bosses threatening the workers' families back home if they tried to run. Armed guards posted specifically to stop people escaping. It wasn't just illegal drug cultivation anymore. It was forced labor, human trafficking.
That's just horrific. So that brings us closer to the present day. 2016. California votes for Prop 64. Legal recreational cannabis. The idea was this would fix everything, right?
That's definitely a major goal, yeah. Create a legal, regulated market, tax it, and hopefully starve out the black market, including these cartel grows.
And did it work?
Well, it's complicated. Legalization has definitely changed the landscape, no question, but the damage done over decades, that doesn't just disappear overnight.
Still dealing with the aftermath.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
NuggNotes points out there are still over 400 known illegal grow sites contaminating forests, cleaning them up. The cost estimates are massive, hundreds of millions of dollars potentially.
And the land itself, the ecosystems.
Still scarred. Areas remain closed off because the soil and water are too toxic. Wildlife populations, like those Pacific fishers, they recover incredibly slowly, if at all, from that kind of poisoning and habitat destruction.
But the illegal grows haven't totally vanished, even with legal dispensaries everywhere.
Not entirely. And the cartels, being adaptable, they've shifted tactics again. Some activity moved indoors into sophisticated illegal warehouse grows, which are harder to spot from the air.
Okay.
And there's evidence they've also just moved some operations to other states, places like Oregon or Nevada, maybe where regulations were initially looser or enforcement stretched thinner. So the problem hasn't vanished. It's just evolved again.
So wrapping this up, it's a pretty stark picture, isn't it? This rapid, often brutal takeover of a really significant cannabis region.
Yeah, driven by huge profits, made easier by the remote terrain, maybe, not enough effective intervention early on.
And the results, just deep environmental wounds, serious social consequences, including violence and exploitation, that are still being felt today, even after legalization.
Exactly. It really lingers.
Which leaves us with a pretty heavy thought, doesn't it? Seeing how lasting this damage is and how adaptable these criminal groups are. What does that mean going forward? Not just for regulating cannabis here or elsewhere, but for protecting our wildlands, our natural resources in any region that might look attractive for this kind of illicit activity.
That's the big question, isn't it? How do you prevent this cycle from repeating elsewhere? It's complex, and the stakes are clearly very high. Something to definitely keep thinking about.